In the summer of 1942, German fighter pilots flying over Stalingrad began reporting something that did not fit their understanding of the war. They were being attacked by an enemy pilot who flew with unusual aggression, closed distances most pilots avoided, and showed no hesitation even when outnumbered. At first, they assumed it was an experienced male ace. Then intelligence reports revealed something that unsettled them far more. The pilot was a woman. At the time, the idea that a woman could compete in aerial combat against the Luftwaffe was dismissed almost everywhere. In Germany, it was considered absurd. In Britain and America, it was considered impractical. Even in the Soviet Union, where desperation forced experimentation, women were expected to ferry aircraft, train pilots, or fly supply missions far from the front. Combat was considered beyond their physical endurance, emotional stability, and tactical instincts. These assumptions were treated as fact. Then one pilot began dismantling them in the sky. Her name was Lydia Litvyak, and she did not ask permission to rewrite the rules of aerial combat. She forced them to change by surviving fights she was not supposed to win, and by killing pilots who had been trained since adolescence for exactly that purpose. From the very beginning, Litvyak's presence in a fighter cockpit was controversial. She was young, small, and openly feminine in a military culture that valued brute strength and stoicism. Commanders doubted her endurance. Fellow pilots doubted her instincts. Enemy pilots underestimated her without hesitation. That underestimation became her greatest weapon. The Eastern Front was not a place for mistakes. Air combat over Stalingrad was brutal, chaotic, and unforgiving. Pilots flew multiple sorties a day, often without rest, in aircraft that lacked the refinements of Western designs. Dogfights were close, violent, and personal. Survival depended on awareness, nerve, and timing. There was no margin for weakness. Litvyak entered this environment with something her critics did not expect. She had absolute confidence in her ability to fight. She flew aggressively, pressed attacks, and refused to disengage simply because the enemy had the advantage. Where other pilots hesitated, she committed. Where others pulled away, she closed in. German pilots noticed her immediately, even before they knew who she was. She flew her aircraft differently. She approached with intent, not caution. She aimed deliberately and fired at ranges that required precision rather than volume. When she broke off, it was not out of fear but calculation. She treated combat like a contest she intended to finish. Her first confirmed victories shocked everyone, including her own commanders. The idea that a woman could shoot down elite German pilots contradicted years of military doctrine and cultural belief. Yet the wreckage on the ground did not lie. The enemy aircraft were destroyed. The pilots were dead, and Litvyak returned. As her victories mounted, skepticism turned into quiet discomfort. Male pilots who had doubted her now flew alongside her, watching her engage and survive. Some resented the attention. Others questioned what her success implied about their own assumptions. The war did not care about those feelings. It only cared about results. Litvyak's presence had a psychological effect far beyond her individual kills. German pilots, once confident in their superiority, began encountering an opponent who did not behave as expected. They hesitated. They misjudged. They assumed she would break off under pressure. She did not. That hesitation cost lives. There was nothing theatrical about her flying. She did not rely on stunts or reckless maneuvers. She relied on awareness, timing, and aggression. She chose when to attack and when to disengage, and she did so with a clarity that unnerved opponents. In a sky filled with noise and confusion, she imposed control. Her aircraft returned repeatedly with damage. Bullet holes scarred the fuselage. Control surfaces were torn, engines sputtered. She survived crashes that should have ended her career. Each time she climbed back into the cockpit. Each time the legend grew. German radio intercepts began referencing a dangerous Soviet pilot whose aircraft carried a white flower insignia. Some pilots began refusing to engage when they spotted it. The nickname White Rose of Stalingrad spread not as propaganda, but as warning. This reaction mattered. Air combat is not only about machines and tactics, it is about belief. When belief erodes, performance follows. Litvyak did not just destroy aircraft, she disrupted confidence. She introduced doubt into a force that depended on it. Meanwhile, back on the Soviet side, her success created an uncomfortable contradiction. Officially, women were still considered secondary participants in combat aviation. Unofficially, Litvyak was becoming one of the most effective pilots in the region. Commanders could not deny her results, but they struggled to reconcile them with doctrine. She was promoted, she was decorated, and yet she was still treated as an exception rather than evidence. The system adapted around her without fully accepting what she represented. The truth was unavoidable. The Luftwaffe was not being outflown by novelty or desperation. It was being outflown by skill. Litvyak's gender did not protect her. It did not weaken her. It did not change the physics of air combat. What it changed was the enemy's expectations, and that change proved lethal. By the end of her short career, she had achieved what many male pilots never would. She had faced experienced aces, survived relentless combat, and emerged as one of the deadliest fighter pilots of the war. Not despite being a woman, but without her gender ever limiting her ability to fight. The claim that women could not fly combat had not been disproven by argument or policy. It had been dismantled at altitude, at gun range, one enemy aircraft at a time. And the Luftwaffe learned that lesson the hard way. As Litvak's reputation spread, the scrutiny intensified. Every mission she flew was now watched more closely, every decision examined for flaws that could justify returning her to non-combat duty. The pressure was constant, but it did not slow her down. If anything, it sharpened her focus. She understood that survival alone was not enough. To remain in the air, she had to keep winning. Combat over the Eastern Front offered no room for complacency. German pilots adapted quickly, and those who survived initial encounters began treating every Soviet aircraft as a potential threat. Litvyak responded by refining her tactics. She learned to exploit moments of transition, the seconds when enemy pilots shifted from climb to level flight, or from pursuit to evasion. She waited for those moments and struck decisively. Her aggressiveness was often mistaken for recklessness by those who did not fly with her. In reality, she was calculating. She chose her angles carefully, conserved ammunition, and disengaged only when the risk outweighed the reward. She did not chase kills blindly. She hunted opportunities. This discipline kept her alive in an environment where many pilots burned out in weeks. There were missions where the odds bordered on impossible, outnumbered formations, sudden ambushes, mechanical failures mid-fight. On several occasions, Litvyak returned with her aircraft barely intact, bloodied but airborne. Each return reinforced her standing among fellow pilots, many of whom quietly abandoned their earlier doubts. Respect replaced skepticism, not because of ideology, but because survival in combat is persuasive in ways no argument can be. German pilots began adjusting their behavior as well. Reports indicate increased caution when engaging Soviet fighters marked with distinctive nose art or unusual flying patterns. While not every encounter involved Litvyak directly, the psychological impact of knowing such a pilot influenced decision-making across squadrons. Air combat depends on rapid judgment, and doubt is an enemy no pilot can afford. Despite her growing success, Litvyak's position remained fragile. Soviet command structures were rigid, and exceptions were tolerated only as long as they delivered results. Any lapse, any misstep, could have ended her combat career. She was aware of this reality and accepted it without complaint. The war left little space for resentment. There was only the next mission. Her victories continued to accumulate. Each confirmed kill represented more than an enemy aircraft destroyed. It represented a challenge to assumptions that had shaped military planning for decades. The belief that combat flying demanded qualities women lacked was being dismantled in real time. not in training exercises or controlled demonstrations, but in lethal engagements against elite opponents. Litvyak herself did not frame her success as symbolic. She did not speak publicly about gender or doctrine. She focused on flying, fighting, and surviving. In doing so, she denied critics the opportunity to dismiss her as an anomaly driven by ideology rather than competence. She was simply a fighter pilot doing her job better than most. The intensity of operations took its toll. Fatigue accumulated, losses mounted, friends failed to return. Litvyak endured these pressures alongside her comrades, sharing the same risks and the same grief. There was no special treatment in the air. Enemy bullets did not discriminate, and neither did gravity. Her continued survival under these conditions further reinforced the reality that she belonged in combat as much as anyone else. On one mission, she was wounded yet refused to abandon her aircraft. She completed the engagement and returned to base, injured but alive. Incidents like this spread quietly among squadrons, adding to her reputation. Courage in aviation is not defined by speeches or medals. It is defined by decisions made in seconds, under fire, with no margin for error. As the months passed, the war around Stalingrad turned decisively. German forces, stretched and exhausted, began losing their grip. Air superiority shifted incrementally, then decisively. Litvyak was part of that shift, one pilot among many, yet her presence carried symbolic weight, whether acknowledged or not. She represented a crack in a belief system that had gone unchallenged for generations. Her enemies never fully adapted to her existence. Even as they adjusted tactics, the assumption that a woman posed less threat lingered, resurfacing at the worst possible moments. That hesitation, however brief, was often enough. In aerial combat, fractions of a second determine outcomes. Litvyak exploited those fractions relentlessly. The cost of sustained combat eventually caught up with everyone. Equipment wore down. Bodies weakened. The sky grew more crowded, more dangerous. Litvyak continued flying despite mounting risks, driven not by recklessness but by commitment. She had earned her place, and she intended to keep it. Her story during this period is not one of uninterrupted triumph. It is one of endurance under scrutiny, of excellence maintained under pressure, and of survival in a war that consumed even the most skilled pilots without warning. Each mission carried the possibility of being the last, and she flew them anyway. By mid-1943, Litvyak was no longer simply a curiosity or a challenge to norms. She was a proven combat pilot whose presence influenced both friendly and enemy behavior. The claim that women could not fly combat had already collapsed in practice, even if it remained unspoken in policy. The question was no longer whether she belonged in the sky. The question was how long anyone could survive there. By the summer of 1943, the air war over the Eastern Front had reached a point where experience mattered more than numbers. Aircraft could be replaced. Pilots could not. Every mission now carried the weight of accumulated losses, and every veteran in the cockpit represented months of survival that could not be replicated overnight. Lydia Litvyak was one of those veterans, and that made her presence increasingly valuable and increasingly dangerous. The Luftwaffe was no longer facing untested opponents. It was facing pilots who understood its habits, its preferred attack angles, and its moments of vulnerability. Litvyak had learned these patterns through repetition and survival. She knew when German pilots were likely to press an advantage and when they would disengage. She knew how they reacted to aggressive counters and how quickly confidence could turn into panic. This knowledge did not make her invincible, but it made her lethal. Her flying during this period reflected a deepening maturity. She became more selective in engagements, choosing fights that offered clear advantages and avoiding unnecessary risk. This restraint was not fear, it was efficiency. She understood that survival was itself a form of victory, and that staying alive allowed her to keep shaping the battlefield. Despite this discipline, danger remained constant. German pilots, aware of her reputation, began actively seeking her out. Encounters grew more intense as both sides recognized the stakes. For Litvyak, every engagement carried the dual burden of personal survival and symbolic pressure. Her failure would be seized upon as proof that her success had been temporary or accidental. She carried that knowledge without complaint and continued flying. There were moments when the strain became visible. Close friends were lost. Familiar voices disappeared from the radio. The sky that had once been crowded with allies grew emptier between missions. Litvyak absorbed these losses quietly, returning to the cockpit because there was no alternative. The war did not pause for grief. In combat, she continued to demonstrate a rare combination of aggression and control. She closed distances decisively, fired with precision, and disengaged without hesitation when circumstances shifted. These habits kept her alive in an environment where hesitation was punished instantly. German pilots who attempted to exploit her perceived vulnerability often found themselves on the defensive within seconds. Her aircraft bore the marks of sustained combat. Repairs became routine. Bullet holes were patched, engines tuned, control surfaces replaced. Each scar represented a moment when physics and chance had aligned in her favor. Each repair sent her back into the sky knowing that the margin for error was shrinking. On one of her final missions, she engaged enemy fighters under difficult conditions. The engagement was chaotic, with multiple aircraft converging at once. Visibility was poor. Communication was fragmented. It was the kind of fight where survival depended as much on luck as on skill. When the battle ended, Litvyak did not return. Search efforts followed, but wartime chaos obscured answers. For months, uncertainty surrounded her fate. Some believed she had been captured. Others believed she had been killed. The absence itself became part of her story, a reminder that even the most capable pilots were never guaranteed a return. What remained undeniable was the impact she had already made. By the time she vanished, she had secured her place among the most effective fighter pilots of the war. Her victories were real. Her survival record was extraordinary. Her influence on morale and perception extended far beyond her own squadron. The official recognition came later, long after the fighting had ended. Records were reviewed. Witness accounts were gathered. The scale of her achievement became clearer with time. She was posthumously honored not because of symbolism, but because the evidence demanded it. Yet even without medals or formal acknowledgement, her legacy had already done its work. The argument that women could not fly combat had been rendered hollow by experience. Litvak's career demonstrated that the qualities required for aerial combat were not confined to one gender. Awareness, discipline, aggression, and judgment were human traits, not male ones. The Luftwaffe learned this lesson under fire. Pilots who underestimated their opponent paid for it with their lives. Commanders who dismissed the possibility of female combat pilots adjusted too late to matter. The sky does not reward assumptions. It rewards preparation and execution. Litvak's story endured because it was not built on exception or novelty. It was built on repetition. Mission after mission, she proved herself in the only way that mattered. She flew, she fought, she survived, until she did not. Her disappearance did not diminish her achievement. It underscored it. She had lasted far longer than many of her peers in a war that consumed pilots at an unforgiving rate. She had done so while carrying expectations and doubts that others never faced. That endurance was itself a form of victory. In the years that followed, historians would debate numbers, confirm kills, and analyze tactics. Those details mattered, but they were secondary to the broader truth. The air war over the Eastern Front had produced a pilot who shattered assumptions through performance alone. She did not argue her case, she demonstrated it. The belief that women could not fly combat had survived for generations because it had rarely been tested under equal conditions. Lydia Litvyak tested it at altitude, against experienced enemies, with no protection from failure. The belief did not survive the test. Her story remains not because it was convenient or inspiring, but because it was unavoidable. The wreckage she left behind and the fear she inspired were real. The Luftwaffe did not care about ideology. It cared about survival. And in that environment, Litvyak proved that skill, not gender, determined who lived and who died. By the time the war moved beyond Stalingrad and the front shifted west, Lydia Litvyak's story had already taken on a life of its own. Even without confirmation of her fate, her absence was felt in the quiet spaces she left behind. Squadrons noticed when an experienced pilot did not return. The sky felt larger, more dangerous, and less predictable without the presence of someone who had proven, repeatedly, that fear could be managed and assumptions could be broken. In the immediate aftermath, her disappearance was treated the same way countless others had been during the war. Records were incomplete. Witnesses disagreed. Chaos obscured truth. The Soviet Union, consumed with survival and momentum, moved forward without pause. There was no time for reflection, no space for legacy. The war demanded attention, not memory. Yet stories persisted. Pilots spoke quietly about the woman who never hesitated, who closed distances others avoided, who treated combat not as spectacle, but as work. Mechanics remembered the battered aircraft that kept returning. Commanders remembered the results they could not ignore. These fragments formed a narrative that refused to disappear, even when official acknowledgement lagged behind. After the war, when the urgency faded and records were re-examined, the scope of Litvyak's achievement became impossible to dismiss. Confirmed victories, survival under extreme conditions, and sustained combat effectiveness placed her among the most accomplished fighter pilots of the conflict. The fact that she had done so while carrying the burden of disbelief only sharpened the impact. Recognition came late, but it came. She was posthumously honored as a hero of the Soviet Union, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a correction. History had caught up with reality. What had been proven in the sky was finally acknowledged on paper. But her true legacy extended far beyond medals or official titles. Litvyak permanently altered the boundaries of expectation. After her, it was no longer possible to argue honestly that women lacked the capacity for aerial combat. The evidence existed, documented, and undeniable. The conversation shifted from whether women could fight to whether institutions were willing to let them. That shift mattered. Wars do not only reshape borders, they reshape beliefs. Litvyak's career forced militaries, historians, and future pilots to confront the difference between tradition and truth. The tradition said combat belonged to men. The truth, demonstrated repeatedly under fire, said otherwise. The Luftwaffe had learned this lesson first, and in the harshest possible way. German pilots who underestimated their opponent did not get second chances. By the time awareness spread, it no longer mattered. The damage had been done. Confidence had eroded. Pilots had died. The sky had become a place where assumptions were punished without mercy. Litvyak did not seek to be a symbol. She did not fly to make a statement. She flew because her country was at war and because she was capable of fighting. That distinction is important. Her impact was not the result of ideology or propaganda. It was the result of competence applied consistently under pressure. This is why her story endures. Not because it is inspirational, but because it is instructive. It demonstrates what happens when belief collides with reality in an environment where failure is fatal. The sky strips away excuses. It reveals skill, discipline, and judgment with brutal clarity. In modern discussions about combat aviation, her name still surfaces, not as a footnote, but as a benchmark. She represents the moment when a long-standing assumption failed under empirical pressure. Once broken, it could never be fully restored. The tragedy of her early death does not diminish that achievement. If anything, it underscores the cost at which it was earned. She did not survive to tell her story or defend her reputation. Others did that for her, piecing together the evidence she left behind in the form of wrecked enemy aircraft and altered behavior on both sides of the front. In the end, the claim that women could not fly combat did not collapse because someone challenged it in theory. It collapsed because one woman flew into the most unforgiving airspace of the war and outperformed expectations repeatedly until the argument became untenable. She outflew the Luftwaffe not because she was underestimated, but because she was prepared. Not because she was reckless, but because she was precise. Not because she was symbolic, but because she was effective. The sky did not care who she was. It cared what she could do. And what she did changed the war, one fight at a time.